Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Anthologies Through a Business Lens. And boy, oh boy, am I excited for this one. Joining me on the show to cover one of my favorite things in the world, anthologies, is the one and only Arwyn Sherman. Hi, Arwyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm excited. I also love anthologies, so I'm pretty excited to come on and talk about them.
Yeah, when you emailed me about this topic, I was like, you are speaking my language. Let's go. But before we dive into our chat about anthologies, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey as an author so far.
Yeah, so I've been writing for a very long time and I've been publishing for a few years. And I like to kind of keep those separate because I think they're kind of two different worlds. But um, I have a few pieces in a few different anthologies, and then I have a novel coming out in 2026 with Conquest Publishing. Um, so yeah, I write like dark fiction, fantasy, horror mostly. And yeah, I just really love this. I think publishing can be like fun and horrible at the same time. So
Yeah.
it's but I enjoy it overall. Yeah, so
Yeah.
and I've learned a lot of the what we're going to talk about today. I've learned a lot the hard way, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to come on here and talk about it because I feel like I ran into a lot of these issues, and so now I feel like I'm not an expert by any means, but I know a little bit and would love to kind of
Yeah,
talk about
well,
it. Yeah.
I think publishing being fun and horrible at the same time is like super accurate. And when it's magical, it's magical. When it sucks really bad. Awesome, awesome. Well, let's dive into our chat about anthologies, my favorite thing ever. So, first, let's talk about finding places to submit. So, there are many anthologies out there. It's humanly impossible to submit to all of them. And aside from the creative standpoint and wanting to submit to anthologies that you feel drawn to, with themes you connect to, and genres that you write in, things like that, we're going to center on the business side and finding anthologies that you feel comfortable submitting to and that you feel like your work is safe with that publisher. So I'm going to give it to you for a couple seconds here. What are your top things in your criteria when you're looking for publishers who are doing anthologies that you would like to submit to?
Yeah, so for me, there's a couple of things I do when I'm researching the press. So I always Google Writers Beware and Absolute Right are two resources you can use for publishers that are known to have bad behavior and people can go and report them and so that's a really easy way. And I always do that for the publishing house and also the editor themselves because sometimes editors will have a publishing house, they will act badly and then they'll go and make a new publishing house under a different name. So I always do that, Googled for the editor and the publishing house. And then also checking Reddit is also a good way, and reading people's experiences. Um, and then of the website themselves, do they have a masthead? What is it? Are the editors clearly advertised or stated? And if they don't have any editors listed, for me, that's an orange flag. For other people, that's a red flag. Because I know some people like to have privacy for other reasons that are not nefarious, but it's just something to notice when you're looking at the website. Um, and what do the books look like, where are they being sold, and is there a variety of authors in their lineup? And that one is, so sometimes people will create a publishing house because they are an author and they want to like look more professional, and then sometimes they'll do anthologies to make their publishing house look like not just them. And that's not a bad thing, but it's just something to notice. And you have to decide if you want to submit to a place where it's kind of more a person that's self-publishing that's just trying to like beef up their collection, versus somebody that's curating an anthology because they're like passionate about the topic, if that makes sense. um, and also just I always, if you're comfortable, you can also DM authors with open inboxes and ask if they're happy with their experience. I'm always open to DM, so if people see something that I've been published in and they want to know if that press was nice to work with, like feel free to DM me. My inbox is open on Twitter. And yeah, I feel like there's definitely that kind of whisper network aspect too. So you can ask around and kind of be like, hey, there's this press. Like, anybody know anything about them? And people who have had good experiences can be like, yeah, they're great. Or if they've had bad experiences, they can, share what their experience is.
Yeah, lots of great information from you. Fantastic. I think one of the things to remember is even though when you're submitting to anthologies and you're submitting poetry, flash fiction, short stories, those are smaller. And so there's less stakes involved than if you were submitting a novel. But at the same time, that's still your work. And you want to be sure that you're treating that work with respect and not sending it to a bad publisher, and I think the thing with anthologies is there is a wide range of the types. Like publishing houses do a lot of small presses do it, but there are authors who were passionate about a certain topic and they wanted to do like a self-published form of anthology. So there's a lot of different things out there, and that's not to say one is better than the others. Just be aware of the editors and the people behind the anthology, their intent with it, and just all around try to put yourself in professional situations that you feel comfortable with, because once your book is printed in an anthology, there's no way to get that out of the versions it's printed in. So you need to keep your reputation
Right.
safe as well.
And for me, like you said, there's lower stakes with short stories, so I'm a little bit more loose with what I'm willing to submit to. Like, if I like a topic and the publisher's not, like, straight up problematic or horrible, I'm kinda willing to be like, "Ah, if it's your pet project, sure, have my short story." But other people aren't, so I like to kind of, it's just kind of what you're comfortable with and what you're okay with your work being in, and yeah, but it's always good to kind of be aware of what you're submitting your work to, I
Yes,
guess,
for
like you
sure.
said.
Yeah. So another side to this as well is whether the anthology pays their contributors and also if there's a submission fee. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, but for me personally, I don't submit to things that require submission fees just because there are enough anthologies out there that don't require you to pay to submit. And it just rubs me the wrong way a little bit just because it can create a barrier for authors who can afford to do that a lot and ones that can't. So I'm all about creating an equal playing field. And so when I see an anthology, especially from like a small press or like an independent editor asking for payment to submit, that kind of turns me away a little bit. On the other side of this, though, with anthologies that don't pay their contributors, where I am right now, I'm totally fine with this because you can look at these anthology acceptances as a way to build your network, build your publishing credits, and to get your work in print. And that has been huge for me just starting out in the whole publishing world and waiting to get my book deal. It's been nice to get copies of books with my work in it. It's been a great confidence boost and it's been a lot of fun. And I've met author friends through being featured in anthologies that they're featured in. And so for me right now, where I'm at, I don't mind submitting to anthologies that don't pay their contributors, but I do not like to submit to places that require a fee to submit. So I'm curious what your take is on this.
I have a pretty similar take. So for me with paid, I I do not pay to submit things. I there like you said, there's plenty of places that don't require a submission fee. I will, because of the gambler in me, submit to paid contests that have like a $4,000 prize money because I'm like, I'll pay $3 to enter my short story in that. But um, that's not what that's just for fun. But yeah, I don't pay to submit to places unless there's a pretty hefty prize attached to it. But just to submit to like be published, I won't do that. Um, and I also will so I started, submitting anthologies to build a bio because, like, I don't have an MFA, I don't have any kind of, like, fancy biography or, to attach to query letters, so I was like, "Okay, I have to get some, like, publishing credits, so that when I'm querying people, I, like, at least kinda seem like I am a professional." So that's kinda how I started, submitting short stories was because I wanted to build kind of that bio and that credibility. And so I will also submit to places that don't pay me particularly, like charity anthologies. I really like because it gives me a way to like help a cause that I care about, but not like give money because um, life is hard. But I can give a story, and then that can like help generate donations for a cause that I care about. So I actually really like charity anthologies. And have contributed to a few of them. And in terms of payment, um, so there's like three, what I consider like three different types of pay. So there's like token pay, semi pro pay, and pro pay. Just so people, you might hear those terms as you continue in this journey. Token pay just means it's like an acknowledgement that you are contributors, like $5 or $10, $20 for a story. Semi pro pay is, I think like 1 to 5 cents is what it's considered. I feel like those change, but 1 to 5 cents per word, and then pro pay is kind of 8 to 10 cents per word. So that's kind of just some terms to know. So if a anthology call for submission says that they're pro paying, that's what that means. And like you, I kind of just am submitting it more for like biography reasons, so I don't mind getting paid less than pro rate. I know I have friends that will only submit to pro rate places, and that like it's going back to my it's whatever you decide you want to do. But that's my perspective is kind of similar to yours.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I as well love when anthologies donate to charities. I think that's great. And I've been accepted into a few of those as well. And it's really nice to see publishers give back in that way. It's great. So now let's shift gears and briefly touch on submission guidelines. So if you find an anthology you like and you research the editor and the publishing house and you got all green lights and you want to submit to that anthology, you definitely want to read the submission guidelines and obviously look out for the main things like what the deadline is, what kind of work are they accepting, flash fiction, short stories, poetry, what their word count limits are, any formatting they want with the header. And I've seen some really weird formatting where people like don't want the paragraphs indented and they want like single space and like weird header situations. So definitely read the submission guidelines. But two things I definitely want to highlight are if they accept previously published work and simultaneous submissions. So there are a lot of anthologies that do not accept previously published work and some do. And so that's something that you definitely want to look into. If it's not mentioned in the guidelines specifically, my go-to is just to assume I should write something new and not assume that they will accept something previously published, because if you get it accepted and then in a contract that says like this work hasn't appeared anywhere before, then you basically are going to have to withdraw that. But in terms of the published work, keep in mind that people are really strict about this. So, like, if you've posted a story on your website in full, then that's considered to be published because it's out there to be read. And so these are stories and other works that have not been posted anywhere before. When it comes to simultaneous submissions, this is when you are sending the same story to multiple places at the same time. Some anthologies are chill with this, others aren't, and if they're not okay with it, they'll usually say somewhere in the submission guidelines that they have exclusivity, so they want to be the only ones to receive that submission, and then obviously if they pass on it, you're free to submit elsewhere. But the ones that do accept simultaneous submissions ask for you to notify them as soon as possible if you have been accepted elsewhere, so you can withdraw that submission and they don't consider it anymore. For the anthologies that don't specify whether they accept simultaneous submissions or not, I kind of take that as it's okay because that's kind of what we do for agents. It's if the agency doesn't
Right.
say like we don't accept simultaneous submissions, then it's kind of assumed in the industry that you can send it elsewhere unless they specify they don't want that. But you can always, of course, reach out to the editors or the publishing house directly if you want 100% clarification.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like more and more simultaneous submissions are there's more and more conversation around how they should be allowed because publishing response times have slowed down so much.
Yeah.
Um just with everything going on in the publishing industry right now. And so I think I always assume unless it says no simultaneous submissions that I can simultaneously submit places. But you're absolutely right. You can always reach out to an editor and clarify that. Um, but I do think that people are moving away from that just because we're looking at months long response times, and it's not super realistic to tell people not to submit to things
No.
if you take 6 months to respond. But
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and especially because some of these places will ghost you, and so
Hmm.
in that instance too, if they request an exclusive look at the story and then ghost you, then you're sitting there thinking, "Are they still considering it, or did they ghost me?"
Right, right. Um,
Oh, man. Awesome. All right. So now let's talk about contracts. So, full disclaimer, neither of us are, we're not lawyers. We're not giving legal advice. We've just been
right.
accepted into several anthologies and we've seen many different forms of contracts and consent forms and things like that. So, this is strictly personal experience. We are not lawyers. So, you can definitely listen to our feedback and things that we've experienced, but don't think that to me and Arwen are your lawyers for today, 'cause that's not
Yeah.
what's happening.
We're not giving you legal advice.
Awesome. So I'm gonna give it over to you here. So what are some things
Yeah.
that you definitely think authors should be aware of and look out for in contracts?
So I think like I said earlier, publishing and writing to me, I separate in my mind because publishing is a business and writing is a creative endeavor. And people, I think, when you have a creative endeavor that you are trying to commodify and make professional, there's this gray area. But at the end of the day, publishing is a business. You have a product and you're offering, to an editor to buy your product. And to think about that for me helps me when making decisions around my work. And also, like with rejections, it's not, that they're rejecting me, they're rejecting a product that I've offered them. And that kind of helps me mentally a little bit. But also, in terms of contracts, thinking about it in those terms can help you avoid kind of getting into a bad situation with a predatory contract. So, not everyone has contracts. I also want to put that out there. Like, especially non-paying places tend to not have contracts. Some of them do, and some of them don't. And you have to decide if you're okay with that. Um, and with for me, if anything involves money, I want a contract. Just because, it's just better to have a contract when it comes to money. Some do email agreements where they email you the terms and you just email them back saying, like, yes, I agree to these terms. Some have a hard copy that you have to scan back. And then there's some who have like more formal signing software where you go into like, I forgot what it's called, but you know what I'm talking about, where you go to a
DocuSign?
yes, DocuSign, thank you. So and it just depends on what the editor wants and what you're comfortable with. And I always keep in mind that not everyone has your best interest in mind as a writer, and that's something that we don't like to think about. But it's true in terms of publishing, and so you have to protect yourself and you have to protect your work. And sometimes I know for me in the beginning, I was so excited to get published that I would just kind of hand wave a lot of like the legal side stuff and the rights. And it's just important to have these in mind. So with that being said, and I think that goes for long form and short form fiction. But so for the most important thing with contracts is like your rights to your work. So what kind of rights are they looking for? So typically it goes exclusive to non-exclusive. So they'll say we want exclusive rights to this story for a certain period of time after the anthology is published, and then non-exclusive. And what that means is they want to be the only ones with that story for a certain period of time. And then after that period of time expires, you can then submit it as a reprint, but they still maintain the right to print that story if they reprint that anthology. So, but after a period of time, they don't have rights to it anymore besides the right to reprint it. So, that being said, a big question is when do you get your rights back after publication? So typically it's 6 months to a year. In my experience, I don't know what the industry standard is, but in my experience, it's about 6 months to a year after the publication of the anthology. You get your rights back, and then you can resubmit it to other places as a reprint. And that's important. I think to me, a red flag, and this is a personal red flag, is if they want the rights to the story for like a really long period of time, like 5 years. I'm kind of like, why do you want it that long? Like, what is going on? And then the two clauses I always look for is there a clause for if the project doesn't happen by a certain date? And that's the one that a lot of people don't think of because it's basically if for whatever reason the project doesn't happen, when do you get to take your story back and have full rights back to your story? Because sometimes, in the small press world, small presses for whatever reason become defunct or collapse or whatnot. And if a small press becomes defunct, but there's no communication, so you don't know for sure what's happening, at what point do you get to like call it and say, okay, I'm taking my story back? Because you don't want to be stuck in this gray area of like, well, I signed a contract for this story. This press doesn't seem active anymore, but I don't want to go, you know, query it elsewhere and then have them suddenly print this anthology and then I'm in this bind where I've, sold a story twice that I don't have rights to sell. Um, so that's a super important clause that I always look for. If it's like, and usually it's like a year out from acceptance. So if the anthology doesn't happen within a year from acceptance, then you get your rights back. And that one's super important. Um, and then also, is there a clause for entry into best of anthologies, which most of them have because that benefits them too. But if you can, because there's a lot of, best, horror of 2022, and you want to have a clause that lets you submit your work to those too, so you can, maybe hopefully make it into that. And for me, what's really important too is there an anti-AI clause? And is the press, do they have an anti-AI statement? Because for me personally, I'm against AI
Me too.
as a creative. Yeah. So I want to make sure that the press isn't going to like have an AI like cover. Cause to me, I would not want my work in anthology where they weren't willing to pay an artist to make an actual cover. So that's also a very important thing. And most contracts now I'm seeing more and more an anti-AI specifically, like an anti-AI clause. But then also often on the website, you can also look and see if they have one. And that's really important for me too. So those are kind of what I look for in contracts. And just always make sure that you are in a position where you can get your rights back if something goes wrong. Um, and that you're not signing away your rights forever. Um, so
Great. Yeah. Lots of great information again. And this is the thing where, as well, I've had every single anthology acceptance I've had, there was some sort of agreement. Some were very simple one page agreements.
mhm.
The one I got was like pages and pages, and my eyes were bleeding. But like, this is a situation too where if you are reading a contract, especially those long ones that are very, very involved, if you do not understand something, like ask a lawyer, or you can even ask the publisher if there's a certain clause that you're unsure about, just to get clarification, because you never want to sign something if you're not fully understanding it. Because if you misunderstand it and something happens, and it's going to come around and bite you in the butt, and it's basically your fault because you didn't take the time to like fully understand it. So you mentioned a lot of great things. The other thing I wanted to add as well is to look for a clause regarding your ownership and the copyright of the story itself. The print rights and their rights to print the story in the anthology is different than your rights to the story. So you want to make sure that you still own your characters, you still own your world and everything. So even if that anthology does have that story specifically for a period of time, you're not restricted in doing additional things with those characters. And this was really important to me for one of my stories that I'm planning on maybe turning into a novel at some point. For that story, it specifically said in the contract that I maintain the rights to the story and blah, blah, blah. They have exclusive publication for 6 months. So that was something you mentioned before about it typically being 6 months to a year. And then after those 6 months are over, I'm allowed to submit that story elsewhere. But even during that period, I was able to do more things with those characters if I wanted to. And so these are just things to look out for. And there are some very different and unique things as well to look out for. That's why you should really read your contract in full. One I got recently said that I was unable to share the file of my story with anyone until publication, which was really interesting. And I get that because they don't want it floating around because it can get out. So that was really interesting to like not share the file across socials or through email or whatever until the anthology was out. So there's just very specific things that people put in their contracts. So just be sure to read it in full and understand before you sign.
Yeah, and I think most editors understand if you have a clarifying question and they're willing to talk about the contract. And if they're not willing to talk about the contract, that's its own red flag.
Yeah.
But so yeah, definitely. And one thing I wanted to add to I was thinking about it as you're saying is language around editing and like what rights they have to edit your story. And if there's a clause where like you have to approve the edits before it prints, because some places, so I had a friend that she was accepted into a podcast. Her story was accepted to be read in a podcast, and they had language where they could edit the story without her okaying the edits before it
Oh,
went live.
no. Oh, no.
Yeah, and the thing is like, this was, like, a really well-respected podcast, and so I talked to some of my other friends who've been on the podcast, and they were like, "Yeah, like, I was really happy with how they handled my story, and the edits were more for, like, making it better read out loud." And so they were comfortable with that, but my friend ended up withdrawing her story because she wasn't comfortable with that. So that going back to like it's a personal choice of what you're comfortable with. So they were protecting themselves because they wanted to make their podcast the best it could be, which required some edits. Um, but she was not comfortable with signing over the or giving them the right to edit her work and then put on the podcast without her okaying those edits. So yeah, so there's that to look out for too. And going and kind of going back to like the Whisper Network aspect too is because that podcast had such a good reputation, people were willing to sign that, but she was not, and that's fine. That's her. It's her story. She can do that. But that's another thing to look out for when you're reading contracts too, is what kind of editing power are you giving people, um, and are you able to reject edits they make, and what happens if they want to edit your story in a way that you're not comfortable with? Do you guys mutually decide to like what's the word, dissolve the contract, or what exactly happens? So yeah, that's another thing that I just thought of as you were talking.
Yeah, well, editing in general, it's really interesting because I've experienced the whole spectrum of editing with anthologies. Some don't really edit and kind of accept the story as is and just do like, obviously, like proofreading, make sure nothing's spelled wrong, but there's not necessarily an editing phase. And I just signed one like this. And in that instance, I went back and reread my story before I signed it just to make sure that was exactly how I wanted it because I knew there wasn't going to be an editing phase. On the other side of this, I got accepted into an anthology that had critique rounds if you wanted them. And we did like 2 rounds of feedback, which was super fun and super cool. And so in that instance, I knew like I was going to be able to revise my story further before the editors send the final version for me to proof before they set it for publication. And so there's a whole spectrum of editing, and this just comes down to the point of sometimes you don't know the amount of editing that's going to go into a story before you submit. That will typically be in the contract or just in conversation with the editors afterward. And also, too, because you don't know that, you don't know when you're submitting how the editor's viewing that story when they're evaluating it. And, this is something that I kept in mind when evaluating Prompt Perfect submissions is we weren't doing very heavy developmental editing on the stories. And so as I was evaluating submissions, there were certain ones that I unfortunately passed on because they needed more work than we were going to do. And so this just comes down to making sure that your story is the best it possibly could be, because you could get lucky and submit that to an anthology and they like the premise, they like the concept, but at least needs a little developmental work. And they're willing to do that when there's other anthologies that accept closer to the version of how it's going to be published, and so you won't get that chance. And so the best thing you can do as an author is to submit your best work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more often than not, editors are not looking to do developmental edits. I think it's actually really cool that you have that experience of going through developmental edits with a anthology editor. But I think for the most part, it's they're like you, where they are more looking for stories that are like fairly ready to go, especially because you're not, you don't know how the writer edits, and you don't know if they're willing to do developmental edits. So I feel like with um anthologies and stuff, it's easier just to accept stories that are already what you want them to be. But uh yeah, speaking of Prom Perfect, I'm in that. You probably know that already, but I'm
Yeah.
very excited to be in that. Um but yeah, that was one that was very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, I cannot believe it, but we're coming down to the end of our chat. I'm sad. I wish we could talk about anthologies all day, every day.
right.
But to wrap up, what are some final thoughts you have to share on anthologies through a business lens?
So, well, first off, thank you for having me on again, and
Yeah.
I always love chatting about, author rights and all that. But I think at the end of the day, my big takeaway is it's that it's your work and you have a right to handle it however you want. And, just make sure that you're handling your work in a way where you're making informed decisions that protect you and protect your work. And just, do your research. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask other people. If something feels weird, you can, ask your friends, like, hey, have you seen this in a contract before? Is this weird? Because, writers are what makes publishing work. Publishing would not exist if writers did not write things. And so we have to kind of keep in mind that we're giving something valuable to that industry. I think sometimes there's a weird power dynamic where, you have these people that are um, giving writers opportunities, but at the end of the day, writers are why those opportunities can exist. So always keep that in mind. Your work is valuable and you deserve to be protected legally and not be taken advantage of. So, which is why I talk so much about this stuff with people. Um, so yeah, that's my final thought.
Fabulous. Well, that was perfect. This has been a great chat. And this brings us to your plot twist. Are you ready?
What's the plot twist?
I'm gonna ask you a question. Ready? A random
Okay.
question. Everyone loves the plot twist. So, if you had the opportunity to lead an anthology, what theme would you want the anthology to be on?
Oh man, I have this dream. I have this dream. One day I'm gonna edit this anthology. I really want to do an anthology of like religious horror, like Monstrous
Oh.
Angels,
Oh, so
so
good.
badly. And one day I will write that pitch and see if anybody wants to have me do that. And then I also want to do it as like a charity anthology that donates to like a bird sanctuary because I just like, wings,
Yeah.
angels.
Oh my gosh. Love
Because
it.
there's like a bird sanctuary that I work with, that I love a lot. So that's kind of my dream. Also, if any, publisher is listening to this and is like, oh, I'd love that, hit me up. Yeah. So that's my
Yeah. Oh
dream
my gosh.
anthology.
Being able to lead an anthology, if that would happen to me, it would be over for all of you.
Yeah,
Oh god.
I would love that, but that's a future goal. I'm just right
Yeah.
now just working on my debut and then
Yeah.
maybe after that.
Awesome. Well, it was a joy having you on the show. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you on social?
Oh yeah, so on Twitter I'm Sherman Arwyn, so that's Sherman like the general in the Civil War, Sherman, and then Arwyn ARW and then Y like young N. And so Sherman Arwyn on Twitter, and then on Instagram, I'm bookish.spinster. I will say I'm not super active on Instagram right now, but I do go through periods where I am. And those are kind of my two places. Feel free to follow me. And like I said, my inbox is open on Twitter. So if you listen to this and you have more questions or whatnot, feel free to drop in that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this amazing chat about anthologies.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And listeners, that is a wrap on this chat with Arwen all about anthologies through a business lens. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thanks for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.